Okay, so welcome everyone to this session on the 29th Quality Congress, Addressing New Directions and Horizons. We've got a team of UN agency heads that I will be introducing one by one as they are called to speak to you. We will do a brief introduction. I will take care of that. Then there will be 10 minutes per speaker, and then there will be 12 minutes for one round of questions of about 3 questions each. But by way of execution of this introduction, I'm very pleased to be here with Calder. I think when we look at the model of the quality management, this is very much within the principles that the UN itself is trying to espouse. Now, in terms of the topic at hand, clearly all of our attention these days, or much of it certainly, has been focused on the topic of COVID. But for us in the United Nations, we believe that while COVID has presented new challenges, what it really has done, it has amplified and magnified existing economic and societal problems that countries already had. But it has put them in a much higher contrast. So we can understand now any weaknesses in health management have had an impact in the way COVID has been addressed. Any differences in the way men and women are treated in society has been amplified, and we see the rise of violence against women. We see the challenges of employment as well, and the lack of proper decent work, as ILO will refer to. And we also see how the situation of businesses and supply chains has been disrupted. Many of these problems are not new, but we have the opportunity with COVID to see if we can build back better. This is a very important principle for us in the UN, and we believe for everyone, and including yourselves, because there are always opportunities in crisis, however difficult they may be. So the different problems that will be addressed by the colleagues all have solutions. Some of them on the short run, some of them maybe in the medium and longer term. One of the important solutions that the UN and member states of the United Nations are promoting is the Sustainable Development Goals. Probably the most ambitious agenda for human development the world has ever had. It is often called Agenda 2030. It's 17 goals to be implemented from 2016 to 2030, addressing everything from education, health, equality between men and women, poverty, industrial development, and topics such as these. Very important, the environment is also an underpinning and cross-cutting topic for all of the interventions. Yes, hello? We believe that the Sustainable Development Goals offers an interesting opportunity for discussion by policymakers, private sector, social actors, and of course the United Nations. Now, if I could now begin to introduce our first speaker, Asya VARBANOVA. She is the country representative for UN Women. She's a Bulgarian national with extensive experience in Eastern Europe, having served previously as head of UN Women in North Macedonia and in Serbia. She arrived in Turkey in early 2019 and has been the representative of UN Women since then. So without further ado, let me pass over to Asya. Asya, over to you.
Good afternoon, Alvaro. Dear partners, dear colleagues, it is really a pleasure and honor for me to join you at this event, very timely event today. And big thanks to our partners and to the Quality of Turkey for organizing it. And greetings to all of you in our virtual room. As Alvaro has mentioned, and as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic started as a global health crisis, but it has in fact become a very devastating social and economic crisis for countries around the world. And as with all crises, the effects of COVID-19 are not gender neutral. They affect women and men, girls and boys differently. And this is due to the pre-existing gender inequalities and the various social and structural barriers to women's rights and to women's participation in economic, social and political life that we had before COVID-19 struck. If we look backwards at the beginning of 2020, we actually started this year as a milestone year in the fight for gender equality and women's rights. This is a landmark year because not only are we celebrating 5 years of the SDGs and entering the decade of action, but also because we are marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is the most visionary global agenda for the realization of women's and girls' rights everywhere. And in 1995, where 193 member states agreed and adopted the Beijing Platform for Action, one of them being Turkey, they really set out a very ambitious path, very ambitious and visionary course of action for the world in 12 critical areas. Now in 2020, 25 years later, we have taken a stock how far we have become, what have we achieved, and what remains to be done. And unfortunately, while we have seen quite significant progress in a number of fields, ranging from increasing girls' enrollment in schools, to huge improvements on maternal mortality, to increasing the participation of women in decision-making positions and in leadership, in political life, in economic life, in the business sector, still we have not come far enough. And still, there is no country in the world that has realized gender equality. The progress we have made has been too slow and too uneven. And with the COVID-19 crisis, there is a risk of rollback. As Alvaro said, we are risking to reverse the gains that we have made in the past and to undermine a lot of the progress on women's empowerment in different areas. Even though we have come far enough, just to give you a sense of what was the situation in 2020 before the crisis hit us, we have more women in leadership positions than ever before, but there are still only 20 women heads of states and heads of government around the world. And in the context of the current crisis, if we look at the representation of women in the health sector, there is a significant underrepresentation in decision-making positions, which is concerning. While women make up 70% of the healthcare sector workers, and this is the case globally, and this is also the case in Turkey, where women are half of the doctors, they're 70% of the nurses, they're 100% of all midwives. At the same time, at the level of decision-making, women are only 25% of health ministers and also in senior positions in healthcare institutions. Since we're talking to many business leaders today and to many of you in the private sector, this is another area where women have been historically underrepresented in senior positions. This year in 2020, we actually have seen a record high of women among Fortune 500 companies. There are the record number of high CEOs, but what is this record number? We have only 7.4% of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies are women. Here in Turkey also, there are 16.9% of women in senior executive positions in the private sector. When it comes to economic life in general, unfortunately, prior to the crisis, despite women being half of the population and half of the population here in Turkey, despite them making enormous contributions to economies, whether in business, whether on farms, whether as entrepreneurs, as employees, or as caregivers at home, they are disproportionately affected by poverty, by discrimination, and by exploitation. Gender discrimination and inequalities, structural barriers mean that women often end up in low-paid, insecure jobs in the informal sector, and they continue caring for families, for children at home, much more so than men. So at the current pace of change, before COVID hit, it will take us over 100 years to actually achieve parity, to achieve equality in some of these areas, for example, in the area of pay or in the area of political participation. Now with COVID, we have further challenges, but as Alvaro said, in fact, we also have opportunities. And this crisis is a call, it's a wake-up call for all of us to build back better in a more equitable way, in a way that really uses and absolutely maximizes on the perspectives of the entire population, on their talents, on their contributions, including women and girls. What we see with COVID-19 is that women have really been at the front line of the COVID-19 response as healthcare workers, as caregivers, as innovators, and also as some of the most exemplary and efficient national leaders in combating the pandemic. On the other hand, various assessments that we have conducted as UN agencies, as UN Women, and also here in Turkey and globally, shows us that women have been disproportionately hit by the economic and social fallout of this crisis. And the impacts of the pandemic are really far-ranging. They range from women losing their incomes, their jobs, to increases in domestic violence at home due to the fact that women have been locked up with perpetrators due to the lockdowns, due to the social isolation measures introduced. Increases not only in physical domestic violence, but also in cyber violence, online violence. Impacts ranging to increase in the disproportionate increase in women's care work at home for children, for the elderly, for the sick, which has increased really exponentially across the board. And until we actually understand these impacts very well and we take decisive measures and deliberate measures, the risk is very high that, again, we will lose the gains that we have made in the past. Here in Turkey, women were very much out of a very big proportion of women, working age women, were actually out of the labor market altogether prior to the crisis. So the employment rate of women was about 29% in 2019. For men, it was about 63%. So there is a very high proportion of women that are not employed to begin with. There is also a very high proportion of women in the informal sector. It stood in 2019, the informal employment of women at 42% compared to 31% of men. There is also a significant pay gap, which is commensurate with the global picture that I'm sure my colleague from ILO will also talk about. What happened with COVID, and this is something we have found in our rapid gender assessment that we conducted in April at the peak of the pandemic, and it has been in fact further corroborated by the official statistical data, is that women lost their jobs to a very great extent, especially women who own businesses or who employ other people. There has been a disproportionate job loss for women, which is risking to actually then go even further backwards when it comes to this employment gender gaps that I mentioned before. Our rapid gender assessment also demonstrated and showed that while there has been a very significant increase for both women and men in terms of increasing their care responsibilities at home, the increase has again been disproportionate for women across all categories of unpaid care work in comparison to men and in comparison before the COVID-19 crisis. This care work at home that women perform to a great extent, which is unpaid and often unrecognized, has a very significant impact on their engagement in the formal employment and also on their ability to combine work, family, and social responsibilities. Last week, we launched a new survey that we conducted together with TÜSİAD and Turconfet, which basically maps the experience of over 300 businesses on how they have dealt with the COVID-19 crisis and how women and men employees have featured during the crisis. This research also showed that the largest difference between women and men employees when it comes to challenges they report have to do with balance challenges and have to do with the rising trend of violence at home, which is affecting very significantly women. And while 3/4 of the enterprises surveyed have reported that they have taken specific measures to reduce the stress on their employees and to improve well-being, there is only 1/4 of these businesses that have taken measures taking specifically the needs of women into account. And not surprisingly, those enterprises that already have higher rate of women employees and higher rate of women in the senior management are doing better when it comes to measures to address women's needs and also improve gender inequality gaps. What can some of these measures and actions be, and how can we use this crisis as an opportunity, as a wake-up call? We all agree that the private sector has a very critical role to play, and there are a number of steps that can be taken. And those steps are in fact something that should be done with or without crisis. But now with the crisis, they're even more urgent and more imminent on the private sector to undertake. Firstly, I talked about women's equal participation in decision-making and leadership, and this should be really recognized as a must. There's plenty of evidence, and also fortunately today there is a widespread acceptance around the world that women bring different experiences, perspectives, and skills to the table. They make very important contributions to decisions and to policies. And these perspectives need to be fully taken into account when we decide what measures to take to deal with the COVID-19 impacts in the long term, short term, and medium term. Companies, secondly, the family-friendly policies and practices can make a very critical difference. Employment and income protection, paid leave to care for family members, flexible working arrangements, access to childcare are very important measures that enable working parents to actually care for themselves, their children, and their families. Third, gender-based violence, which has been identified as the shadow pandemic during COVID-19. It has increased globally as well as here in Turkey. And this is really calling on all of us to take urgent measures, and the private sector needs to do likewise to leverage their existing resources and influence to keep women safe at home and safe at work. And there is a whole spectrum of measures that can be taken to basically exercise this duty of care that employers have to their employees who work remotely or who work in offices. Yes, I'm coming close to the end, to basically ensure that companies have a zero tolerance policy to violence. Fourth, COVID-19 provides us with opportunity to better balance the time women and men spend on care work, to change the stereotypical gender division of labor, and to also recognize the importance of care services for all, and to ensure that such care services are accessible and quality and available for all employees. So through such proactive, transformative, measurable policies, companies and the business sector can really contribute to fostering an enabling environment in which women can make a difference, they can meaningfully participate and thrive in the economy. We have a lot of good practices in Turkey. I can talk about some of them later in our discussion, which we need to build on, and we need to really amplify across the private sector here in the country, also to serve as examples outside of Turkey and globally. And we invite more companies to become such good examples and to join these frameworks that we have and these good practices that we have initiated, that many of you have initiated, to deal with the COVID-19 impact.
I assume that Alvaro is passing to me because that is the agenda. So thank you, Alvaro. Even though we couldn't hear you properly, I try to be as brief as possible to give like a different additional perspective on the COVID-19 and what represents for women, both for the developed world and for the developing world. Of course, the COVID-19, we all agree, it started as one of the most dramatic health crises in generations. It spread very quickly into a humanitarian crisis in many places of our globe, but then it has become clearly a development crisis and a systemic shock. It is a systemic shock because unlike any other phenomenon, maybe with the exception of climate change, is really challenging our society, our economy, and our planet from all points of view. I just give you an example, is the Human Development Index. You know, since 1990, we are calculating the human development levels of countries around the world every year. So it's by now 30 years, let's say, and for the first time in 2020, this year, the Human Development Index is forecasted to drop, and to drop quite dramatically. This has never happened before, not even the crisis of the 2008 and the different economic, let's say, recessions since the 1990s. And this is a sharp decline in the Human Development Index. What does this mean? This means, for those of you who are familiar with the human development, it measures not only the economy, not only the income, but also the health through life expectancy and education through the of schooling, because the idea is that together these talk about our level of life, our well-being. Well, the income, as you can imagine, down big time, forecasted to go down by 5%, the GDP, the global GDP this year. But then also in education and in health, we see droppings, and this is so unequal between developed and developing countries and within countries. So the first element when we go and analyze the health and education, let's say, dimension, is that as Alvaro was suggesting in his intro, the COVID-19 is exacerbating inequalities, all sorts of inequalities. I give you just an example. When we look at education, for example, in developed countries, it's estimated that 20% of kids or students are out of school because of the COVID-19. When you look at, or where we look at developing countries, this rises to 86%. Can you imagine? 86% of school-age children are not attending school, not even remotely, which means if this protracts, can lead to a lost generation or serious challenges for the human development in the future. Same applies in the health system. When you look at developing countries, and developed countries already are struggling big time, we see the US, we see Europe, what's going on in the hospitals. But let me give you some numbers that are shocking. In developed countries, we have more or less 55 beds in the hospital per 10,000 people, 55. In developing countries, 7. 30 doctors to 2 doctors, and 81 nurses to 6 nurses. What does this mean? This means that this is so unequal. The impact is that more people will be dying, are dying, and are not attended in their health necessities in developing countries, and in those parts, in developed and underdeveloped and developing countries, that are actually more vulnerable and less equal. So this is something that is very important to keep in our mind. That is a systemic shock. As a systemic shock, it needs a holistic response, a developmental response, and within the shock, inequalities are rising all over the place. So this is a very important ideas or elements to take into consideration. So the question is, okay, what to do in front of that? The situation is quite, of course, Asya was saying, this is a challenge, but it's also opportunity. I do agree. However, the challenge is at a scale that has not been seen before, again, with the climate change. Have we been good in responding to climate change? The answer is we don't think so. Have we been effective in responding to climate change? Very patched response and not really a global advance on this one. So this is very much a call for all of us, multilateral organization, bilateral organization, governments, most of all private sector, as I was mentioning, to come together and to discuss some very bold agenda. Alvaro mentioned the SDGs, okay? In 2015, the whole world came together on the first and most ambitious global agenda ever developed for humanity. And 2020, 2030 was supposed to be the decade for action, okay, to accelerate the SDGs. The net result with the COVID-19 that is happening is that we are actually going back, as I was telling you before, rather than going forward. So there is how not to lose too much ground in terms of SDGs and how to produce, and this is the most important point that I want to raise, how to produce those systemic changes that can be game changers. And I'm talking about specifically 4 main areas. One area is the area of the digital transformation. It's very clear how COVID-19 is helping us understand the importance of digital transformation for transparency in governments, for the private sector and the business, for remote schooling. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We can keep going and going, how important this digital transformation has to be. If you look at the 2019 Human Development Report, actually, you would see that this was in itself a source of big inequalities, because access to digital means is very unequal around the world, so we have to keep that in mind. A second one is social protection. In social protection, until COVID-19, countries, developed countries, they didn't even entertain the idea of having something like universal basic income, with few exceptions, or plenty of spending their reserves in order to keep people afloat not to let them drop into poverty. Now has become quite a widespread debate. This must make us think, okay, what is the state capacity to provide social protection? How can we use the fiscal spaces, and Turkey is a case in this one, in order to provide protection? How can we improve the efficiency and the coverage? And of course, Özge will discuss about the informality in the informal sector and how this impacts unequally on that one. This has to do with this idea of the social protection and the fiscal space. A third dimension is the governance. We have to look for a new social contract, because the way, let's say, policy priorities and policy decisions, let's say, are driving us, the direction is a direction that is definitely not sustainable, because it's not in a direction of a systemic change. So the governance, a new social contract between private sector, the public sector, the civil society becomes so important. Data availability, transparency, capacity, again, technical and digital capacities from government side, so important. And last, and maybe almost most important, because it closes the circle with the climate that I was mentioning before as other systemic shock, is the green recovery. When we look at 2030 and beyond, we must factor in the recovery, in the building. You're saying building back better, I would say building forward better, okay? In the building forward better towards the 2030, the Green Deal and the green recovery is key. We have to create jobs in the green economy. We have to sustain, we have to subsidize, we have to invest on this one. This is a game changer. If we refuse to do that, we're not gonna meet the SDGs, we're not gonna meet the Paris Agreement, we're not gonna decarbonize our economy, we are not having a risk-informed development. At the end of the day, our lives, our kids' lives, our own generation and the future generation will be negatively affected. I will conclude at that, really, again, emphasizing the importance of connecting these dots, of connecting the different areas that I was highlighting, because we are in front of a systemic shock that requires systemic solutions.
And okay, I will actually thank you also, Alvaro and Claudio. And already Claudio has mentioned about points that, you know, very much related to the also industry and manufacturing sector. But in my, you know, speech, I will like to first introduce to what is UNIDO doing in this to respond to and recover. And in the second part is the resilience, how best resilience industry could be, you know, established. Also, I will mention for future shocks, not to avoid future shocks. This is my presentation. In fact, you know, as you know, COVID-19 pandemic is the defining global health crisis of our time and the greatest challenge we have faced since World War II. Enterprises that were dependent on global value chains have been significantly harmed. Some haven't have survived already. That we've been experiencing this in our daily life. That's we've seen lots of, you know, shops that we've been shopping before that, you know, closed down and so on and so forth. And industry, the effect is more. Actually, when we see the, for instance, the tourism sector is mostly, you know, affected, and as well as the leisure, you know, market, also hotels, restaurant, and so on, many, and garment sector also that we see that is very much affected by COVID. And the enterprises that were dependent on global value chains have been significantly harmed. Some haven't have survived already. And the UNIDO's approach is based on the following action points: are prepare and contain, respond and adapt, recover and transform. So we can highlight those three, you know, action points by which UNIDO developed COVID-19 industry recovery program, which offers different phases to recover for industry. Phase one requires initial assessment and analysis. So when we go into action, we first see what is the situation and to assess this and to analyze this. So it is significant. The impact of the industrial sector of each industry have to be analyzed on the risks. For instance, food security, economic resilience, pandemic preparedness, employment, national supply and demand, sustainable consumption and production. Those are the things that we have to analyze. Therefore, a detailed assessment report should be prepared to be used by the government to agree with key national stakeholders to be supported. Second phase is consensus building. When you go to action, you must ensure that first, the stakeholders in the industrial sector might have different view on the problem faced. So the challenges ahead and the objectives of national industrial sector recovery. So the need for consensus building is crucial. Third phase, developing a national industrial recovery plan. So the national industrial recovery plan should be based on achieving the agreed national consensus and should identify key national value chains and existing national and regional legislation, regulation, which needs to be revised. We have to also take care of that. And also new legislation, regulation, which needs to be introduced in order to support growth of national and regional value chains. Funding source. Funding is important, like commercial, state funded, and or from a development finance institution, maybe. We have to identify that. Finally, support programs to be implemented at the enterprise level. This should be enterprise level. And also phase 4 requires the piloting national industrial sector recovery. So this sector recovery also has some different stages, like selection of priority value chains, selection of cluster development, identification of pilot enterprise, implementation of enterprise-specific upgrade program, monitoring, also important. But finally, replicating this pilot success to achieve national industrial sector recovery is key. So, therefore, the replication of successful pilot projects should be encouraged to lead to national industrial sector recovery. So my second part is resilience. So how our industry become more resilient for future shocks. So in fact, as you know, UNIDO is the specialized agency of the UN, which promotes inclusive and sustainable industrial development, the pillars of which reflects fully how industrial sector could be resilient for similar shocks in the future. So resilience of private sector to future shocks highly depends on, first, inclusiveness. So what is inclusiveness? Industrialization can significantly contribute to poverty reduction and prosperity by promoting structural change, generating employment, and facilitating more efficient use of resources. So, however, its benefits have not historically been enjoyed by segments of the population. Women, youth, vulnerable groups, refugee community as such are more affected than the other groups, as Asya also underlined earlier. The second point is sustainability. Like any progress on poverty eradication will be short-lived if we don't succeed in achieving the necessary economic growth within an environmentally sustainable framework. For instance, a more resource-efficient circular manufacturing model needs to replace the current linear production system, which are highly wasteful and polluting, by enhancing the symbiotic relationship between local consumption and production cycles to achieve sustainable production and consumption. Furthermore, resilience of countries' industry and its ability to perform and adjust to shocks depends highly on its diverse, dynamic, innovative, and collaborative capacity, which emerges from its industrial common meaning, knowledge and capabilities, resources, technical, design, operational as such. For instance, when it comes to PPE, we have to remember that Turkey and China as well have been able to adapt better because they developed industrial commons with a combination of manufacturing capacity, access to raw materials, and importantly, to knowledge as well as quality assurance and standardization capabilities. Therefore, recovery packages for post-COVID-19 manufacturing industry must establish the basis for disruptive change towards inclusive and sustainable industrial development. So it shouldn't provide temporary recovery. Lastly, COVID crisis exhibits a unique opportunity to leverage fourth industrial revolution, digital transformation to future productive sectors, fostering long-term resilience and build better future. As Claudio also mentioned earlier, that such as the drones, robotics, 3D printings, blockchain, big data, Internet of Things as such should be in place for long-term resilience for in particularly in developing world and developing economies. So thank you so much for organizing these useful events, and we had opportunity also as UN to introduce what we've been doing on those fields. Thank you so much.
Özge, I think it's over to you.
Yes, I think I should start. Thank you, Claudio. Good afternoon, colleagues and partners and participants. Let me first thank to Calder for the kind invitation for the UN agencies and giving us the opportunity to be part of this virtual discussion. So when the previous Calder Congress, Quality Congress was organized last year, I think we could not certainly imagine that our life would radically change in a few months' time. So as clearly underlined by my colleagues, the COVID-19 has an unpredictable and unprecedented impact on the whole society and world of work. Even though it's not easy to frame the whole picture, although my colleagues described the situation in a very nice manner, let me briefly start also with the main socioeconomic challenges of COVID-19 with some with reference to some data produced by ILO. So according to the last ILO monitor, since the beginning of the pandemic, the hours worked have declined by around 17%, which means that almost more than 495 million full-time job equivalent jobs globally have been lost. So this is a huge loss. And when it comes to the Europe and Central Asia, that region have lost the equivalent of 55 million full-time jobs during the same period. So for workers, the impact has clearly been severe among the most vulnerable layers of the workforce, such as young and female workers, informal workers, refugees and migrants, and of course, older and disabled workers due to the cuts in the care services. So the situation is particularly alarming among informal workers, with 4 out of 5 of them, meaning that 1.6 billion out of 2 billion have suffered dramatic income declines. It's obvious that not just only workers, but also businesses and enterprises across a range of economic sectors are also facing catastrophic losses, which threaten their operations and solvency, especially among smaller enterprises. In spite of recovery measures put in place all around the world, including Turkey, the situation remains fragile, and building back better will take time, efforts, and also resources. So as Asya has already indicated, the pandemic has been a wake-up call for all of us. It has shown the strengths, but also the weaknesses of the economic structure and institutions. So the crisis has once again proven that people matter, and the social dialogue, labor standards, human rights, social protection, and also workers' fundamental rights are not optional. So in other words, the crisis has confirmed that crucial need to invest more in people, in employment, social protection to strengthen solidarity within and among countries, and reinforce the multilateral system in accordance with the recommendations of the ILO Center Declaration on Future of Work. So as already indicated by my colleagues, in light of these, also we should ask what is next and what could be done for a decent building back better. So from the beginning of the pandemic, the ILO emphasized that the crisis has a human face and it requires a human-centered approach. So this response is structured, the ILO's response is structured under 4 pillars. The first is stimulating economy and employment. The second one is supporting enterprises, decent jobs and incomes. The third one, protecting workers in the workplace, especially when it comes to the occupational health and safety. And last but not the least, relying on the social dialogue for sustainable solutions. So as the ILO, we will focus on the economic, social, and labor challenges of a post-pandemic world of work. And actions for building back better and for the future of work are fully complementary with that, we believe. So both will happen at the same time, and labor is the essential part of it. For example, we need to work on specific issues that are key to both future of work and recovery, like teleworking modalities, new working modalities, including flexible working arrangements, artificial intelligence, and digitalization, and of course, occupational safety and health and safe work issues. So the crisis has clearly proven that we need to work together with governments, social partners, meaning workers and employers organizations, and also multilateral institutions to leave no one behind. So it means that sustainable development goals, as already indicated by Alvaro and my colleagues, that shall remain at the top of our agenda. It means more investment from governments are needed for jobs, sustainable incomes, and for extended social protection for all, including for all vulnerable groups. So we should also do more to address the unequal impact of the crisis on women. So this needs to include closing gender gaps in access to decent jobs, equal treatment, including equal pay for work of equal value, and improving working conditions. And also more support for women entrepreneurs and women-led cooperatives are also crucial. And finally, more investment in the care economy. Improving access to care-related leave and affordable care services are also crucial, and we should not forget those critical areas. We must also pay particular attention to the situation of most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in the labor market in our recovery policies. If we don't, the recovery could make existing injustices worse. So the temporary measures to extend the social protection to previously uncovered groups in the last few months should be transferred into the long term, and sustainable social protection mechanisms, including the universal basic income as indicated by Claudio, should also be strengthened. And last but not the least, we need to also work towards a sustainable recovery which fully respects international labor standards and also which is also reflected under the social contracts that has been promoted by the ILO. So let's not forget that at this moment of crisis, safeguarding the four fundamental principles and rights at work, including freedom of association, including collective bargaining, and also elimination of child labor and discrimination in employment, is more important than ever. So all of these elements provide guidance for policies that could deliver on the commitment to build back better. So before just completing my brief remarks, I just would like to give a few words on what ILO in Turkey is doing in response to COVID-19. So very briefly, we have reoriented our priorities in Turkey. We are implementing a comprehensive response to help businesses and also workers to cope with the crisis. Our cooperation takes the form of technical work, advocacy activities, studies, and even indirect financial contribution support through grants to support financially the most affected small businesses in collaboration with the Ministry of Family, Labor and Social Services. So we conducted several assessments, rapid impact assessments on labor market, on youth and women's employment. We provided health kits and personal protective equipment to the seasonal agricultural workers and their families. And we are also supporting women-led cooperatives to continue their production during the time of crisis. So, and also we also contribute and also deepen our collaboration with the UN agencies in response to COVID-19, and we continue our support to businesses and private sector, particularly with collaboration UNDP on human rights and due diligence. So, I mean, as I indicated and already emphasized and underlined my colleagues, that the building back better will take some time, definitely, and we'll continue to support our constituents and partners in this challenging endeavor. So thank you very much for your patience, and looking forward to discussion. Over to you, Alvaro.
Colleagues, thank you so much. I think Alvaro is still experiencing some technical issues, so unfortunately he can hear us, but we cannot hear him. So I'm going to step in on his behalf to complete this panel. We have a bit of time left to take a few questions from the audience. I think we will only have time for 2, maximum 3 questions. Before that, I just want to thank all of my colleagues for their very comprehensive and complementary interventions. And I think one of the things that we heard as a kind of a theme across the board was the need for very bold, urgent, and deliberate actions to deal with the complexity of this crisis and actions by all segments of society, and the importance of partnerships. So now over to you, dear audience. We will be taking a few questions. I hope we can hear them. And a number of technical challenges. Of course, this is not the end of this conversation, and we know that we will continue engaging in future discussions with many of you. We are already working closely with many of the invitees and members in this important event today. So this is not the end of it. We're very happy, if I may maybe conclude on behalf of this panel, simply because we cannot sort out the technical issues. We're very happy that we got the opportunity to contribute, to share with you some of our observations. This is such a complicated and important topic that we can really talk for hours. There's a lot to say and there's a lot to do. So I think that maybe the final sort of word from my side is that let's really join our efforts and let's take those bold actions that need to be taken so that we leave this world to the next generation in a better shape than we have it today, and we are stronger and better to deal with new crises. We know that that's not going to be the final crisis we have to deal with. We have the magnitude of challenges coming our way, which are compounded by climate change and by existing inequalities that we all need to deal with. So hopefully, I think by joining forces together and understanding the urgency and the importance of these actions, we can make a difference for the future generations. The UN system is here to work hand in hand with all of you, from the government, from the private sector, civil society, employers and workers, organizations, and each and every one of you under the principle of leaving no one behind. And we very much hope that together we can move the needle, we can reverse these negative effects of COVID-19 and indeed reach the SDGs by the year 2030. So thank you so much from all of us. We apologize for the technical problems. The conversation continues, and we wish you a good rest of the day.